and I can relate to it too as a woman looking at it. There's many different meanings that I read from these pieces, and I can't wait to have a conversation about her and her work. I do want to ask, is her son Adam here in the audience? Oh, hi! I just want to say thank you so much. I'm so excited that you're here. So maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm saying anything out of turn. And certainly you too, because you seem as though that you've had so much reading about her. So Tom has helped me here with a few questions, and I have some questions here. What we're just going to do, just to talk about the format here, we're just going to have a moderated conversation between all of us for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then after that, we're going to open it up to you. And I see this moderation as an opportunity to warm all of you up. So I'm hoping that is a good charge and challenge for all of you to be able to engage in a conversation further, and then afterwards to be able to look at the work more and hopefully in a different light. Okay, so I'm just going to start by going around, and I'm going to start with Melissa. And so Melissa, you know, Honoré's had this incredible life, right? She did have this incredible life. I feel like she's alive. Hopefully she's with us today. I mean, it's really wonderful to think about that, if she would be here. And, you know, it's interesting reading her history. She has been a working artist. She was a working artist her entire life. She had 2 marriages, one of which was, she was married for over 60 years, right? And of which Adam is a part of her second marriage, correct? And given what we know about her, her privileged upbringing and her marriages, did you think she considered herself liberated or unliberated? Now, with that question though, which Tom was great to suggest that, with that question though, it's interesting because some of the paintings, and Ted and I were speaking about some of these paintings here, there's meaning that's hidden there, it feels like. Like in this painting, we were looking at this, I think this is a very strong painting, and my husband was saying here that her arm, and Ted was saying her arm looks very strong, like she can take it and then strangle the guy right there or something. You know, and that fact that his head is covered in flowers, like there's so much meaning there. It feels like she got, as Ted and I were talking about, a lot of power through her paintings to be liberated. Well, what do you think?
Well, actually, I'm not going to start this discussion with what is related to this painting, but we can end with it. So we're going to maybe bring it up later.
So we're going to have to wait for that.
Yeah, you're going to warm me up to get
there.
Very good. Yeah, so there are a lot of hidden things that she painted out over the years that we know. For instance, these flowers are different. They were originally tulips and lilies, and then she went in later and painted them. And so a number of these things, you know, there are images of what they show up. So fine, I'll go ahead and just jump us right into this. So this actually, going through all of her drawings, there was only one drawing that was explicitly, and she writes on the bottom of it, my first study for nursery rhyme, or for nursery rhyme. And, okay, fine. But it has these 2 figures, and there's a cat over here and a dog, and then there's a mirror, which is now covered with the cloth. So then as I'm going through all these hundreds and thousands of drawings, I realized that this is a motif, this composition keeps showing up. So there's 6 of them. And actually I looked this back up. I did not know this was going to come up, but for some reason in preparing for tonight. And the mirror has a penis in it.
Ooh.
And a couple of them like in a red penis, and then it's not there, and then it's the 2 of them, and then there's a moon hanging in it for a while. So there's a lot hidden. Or at least, you know, I wouldn't say hidden, actually. I would say that there is a process of thinking through something, and of not being so directive, right? I mean, it's a move from a literal language to a poetic language, and I think often we verbalize paintings and we verbalize images, and we want them to be direct, and she points at a lot of stuff in her paintings, right? There's a lot of gesture and pointing and direction. But I think when we turn into words, visual images, I mean, we all know this, right? We lose something. It's a visual language. It's not a verbal
It's intangible.
language. Right, and so I think her putting the curtain uncertain over that, or is her own process of moving from something literal, and in fact you could look at her career as moving from a more literal, direct social engagement or a more literal, direct visual language to a poetic one, and even a coded one as she needed to with the onset of the folklore.
So back to the question then, do you think that she was liberated?
Yeah, okay, yeah, so you did that.
Or not liberated? I mean,
well, does anyone think they're not liberated?
Well, but I think, but women, as we know too, but women, especially during some of the times of her life, I don't know if all of it, because I can't speak for her, were oppressed, and I just wonder if you feel, in knowing her work, like, and also it says to me that she probably was really liberated within herself and used the painting as a way to be able to share that power. What do you think?
Right, to be able to balance it. Well, I guess I have two just quick points. One is that, I don't know what liberated meant to her, but did she see herself as equal in her world? Yes,
she did.
Absolutely. I think, and there are, I try not to put words in someone else's person, but there are accounts. So for instance, in 1958, her dealer writes to her and calls her Mrs. Zagarin. And she writes back in 1958, she says, no. She says, my name is Honoré Sharrer. My husband is Dr. Zagarin. So she corrects him in 1958 in a very, letter. But she also, her husband tells this story, and I can't remember if it's written or if he told me directly, because I'm old and I can't remember anymore, but where he needed to learn how to drive, and she knew how to drive, and they were in Amherst, and so they made arrangements that they would go out at 8 o'clock every morning, and she would teach him how to drive, and then she would go to painting. And he was late at one point, or he wasn't learning quickly enough or something, and she got very short with him and said, no, I start painting now. If you can't be here on time, then, go learn from someone else. Wow. And he says that, he says, I don't know if she was liberated, but she was definitely hard, and she was very clear. And so I think in that sense, her marriage was pretty balanced. I mean, she saw her work as being an artist, and Perez's work was being scholar. And those took equal, and actually, in my essay in the book, I think, I talk about that's modeled, maybe not so much on being liberated, but it's modeled on progressive relationships in the 30s and 40s, leftist and communist relationships where both partners were activists, typically made room for that activism.
Interesting.
So that's my one point, but my other point is I worry about talking for someone who I never met. And even if you know someone very closely, right, or you did, there's a danger of talking over them because you have ideas in your head. So, but what I would like to see is her feminism or liberatedness in the paintings, and I think the paintings are pretty
liberated. They definitely do.
And I think it's because she centers the female body. Like, she allows the female body to be, when I look at these, sometimes I think of Man is the Measure of All Things, right? And the Leonardo, so it's the male body, right? Or it's the Pollocks of the world who could seriously address universal human conditions. Mm-hmm. And she totally throws it. It's the female body that she normalizes and centers as the ability to speak, not just for feminist things, but for universal human conditions. And I think that's liberated. I think that's feminist.
And I think some of the things too, I feel uncomfortable a little bit because Adam is here and he could probably answer a lot of that. But I would love to come back to you and talk with you about maybe your comments.
Well, I'll just say this, and it's very concise, perhaps. She could identify authority. She didn't recognize it particularly. Let's leave it at that.
No, that's good. That's a big period to the end of a sentence. So, okay, wonderful. So now I do want to get into this conversation too about women period and bring it back to today and the climate for women working in the arts. So, Jessica, do you think that the climate, women working in the arts how has it changed since the Cold War era when Honoré was painting? And I think even in the last 10 years, I think we can all comment on this as far as if it has really changed in a way. Now, what I found fascinating about Honoré's life is that she was always working, not just as an artist, but she was a welder. She had all of these jobs in her life. there was an integration of her as an artist in society, which oftentimes, like, it does happen, but it's not regarded and it's not applauded as it was for her. I mean, I think it was in 1948 or 1943, I want to say 48 or 43, that she was on the cover of Mademoiselle magazine. And how amazing is that? I mean, to be able to be revered on a popular magazine, that doesn't really happen so much anymore. So what do you think about that? Do you think that, how has it changed, even in the last 10 years of since she's died, which is 2009 till today?
I mean, I think that it's been very little change over a very big span of time.
Yeah.
And when you look back, when you like seriously look back, it's not enough, right? There just hasn't been enough change. And when you think about how much time has passed, I mean, when I think about the Cold War, like, it feels like a very masculine time. Like, you think superpower, right? You don't think femininity, like, when you're thinking about superpowers.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it was like the age of women. But I do think in you know, and I try in my job, in my life, and what I do, thinking about now and how to move forward. And I think that's a better place to be thinking, because when you get bogged down, especially even in the last 10 years, when we've had a little bit more movement, forward, you still just get a little down that it hasn't moved faster.
That's correct.
And we're still, you know, depending on your perspective in the art world and the market, we're still judging artists based on their auction records and the prices that, you know, that their work is going for on some level, and women just aren't there. They're still not there. They're not, you know, they're, I think the highest, you know, piece sold at auction, you know, for a work by a woman was around 14 million. And when you think about, you know, comparing that, and that could change next week with all of what's going on in the market, but it's just women competing against other women for that number, because the number for men is 150 million, right? That's the highest. That's, you're looking at 14 to 150, like, that's crazy. That's a really big jump. I mean, we hear a lot of numbers in the world about, you know, getting paid 81 cents on the dollar for, you know, women to men, but like, when you think about that jump, that's gigantic. I mean, those are dollar amounts we can't even like fathom a gap in the market for women artists and male artists.
Not even for living women artists.
No, that is not living.
Because
living
that's
is
about half of that.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
There's still a big gap for living male artists and female artists.
Right.
Like 9, 15, yeah, something like that, yeah.
I know, I just can't stop looking at this painting after talking about that with that woman with the Robert Motherwell and about class, and here we're talking about that. That's so interesting.
I know, isn't that great? I love that.
Right, and I'm distracted by her. She's in the room with us, I think. So Natalie, what do you think then would be the best context for Honoré's work today? Like, if you could think about it, you know, of course in this gallery, but like thinking about because it feels in this gallery, it's very contemporary, right? Like, what other works do you think of other women artists besides yourself do you think you could see in context with her work? Because I think about a lot in the literature that I read, it doesn't talk about any artists that she was with, any female artists. And I know that's very, very important in our culture today as women and also women artists to have other female artist friends to have as a support. So just thinking about context and also what would that group be today? Can you think of some artists? What if you were to curate a show with her work in that? What would that be, that context?
Can I just ask you one question? She was not really recognized in her lifetime to the degree that she should have been. It was quite late before she had her first big.
Well, no, she was actually recognized very early on.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the system of museums, is that the early stuff is what defines her. And my argument is it's actually much, I mean, she was in her 20s when she was
Yeah,
doing
she
that stuff.
was
I think it's the
in her-
later
right,
stuff,
but
but
the
no, she
later-
has her last solo show in 55, 53, and then, yeah.
But would you say that the earlier stuff, that she was recognized more as an illustrator and not a fine artist?
No, I think as a fine artist, she's
Yeah.
in 14 Young Americans, and she's in the Met, I should know these, Young American artists, and the 10 female artists at Smith College, but then it does then it ends.
Dies off.
She showed at MoMA and the Whitney. I mean, she was in all those major museums for many years.
But in terms of having a big retrospective, it was.
No.
It was much,
That's pretty rare too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's into the, Adam might correct me on this, it's her next solo commercial show isn't until the 70s. Yeah.
And that seems.
Yes,
Like
it's
a problem.
yeah, she's working on her own without that.
And we also had this big, you know, in the 70s, there were a ton of shows by women artists all of a sudden, which a lot of women artists said, I don't want to be a part of an all-women artist show. I want to, you know, be compared to my peers, all of them, without the lens of gender, right? So,
So what's a context, do you think, for this work?
I think I would like to think about her work in terms of contemporary art generally, back to that idea. I think the tropes and the way that she constructs paintings in terms of you know, areas of flatness, figuration, illustration, an illustrative edge, but you know, a strong grasp of art history and referencing of art history and the Renaissance, and that these kind of surrealist slippages, that this is, I think, what defines contemporary painting now. I think about, you know, artists using these devices, specifically being women and a lot of artists of color. I think it's a way to kind of, as she did and as these paintings do, talk about the slippages of power and how things can transform. And I think that, you know, I've been working a lot with fairy tales, unsanitized fairy tales, and she also, there's a quote here about her work with mythology and nursery rhymes and fairy tales, and I think that's very related. That's how fairy tales use surrealism, and I see that in artists, you know, Nathaniel Mary Quinn, Inga Essenhigh, there Rashid Johnson. There's so many contemporary artists using these tropes now.
Oh my gosh, I can totally see this work with Rashid Johnson.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in a dynamic, wonderful, I mean, I can completely see that in a completely different context other than the museums that she has shown in the past. Now, in your catalog, the essay that you so generously wrote, you mentioned that you considered yourself part of Honoré's lineage. So who else belongs to her lineage? So this sort of dovetails to what I just mentioned, like a context. And how would you define her legacy? What do you think?
Well, I think the artists that I mentioned, artists, you know, working with these kind of surrealist imagery and slippages, how would I define her legacy? Personal, but also political. You know, I think about the homages to art history being a strong part of them. You know, I think about her work in contrast to someone like Paul Cadmus, who was so overt in his depiction of sexuality, whereas hers feels much more, there is sexuality, but it feels really highbrow and literary to me, and the way that you move through her paintings and read objects and images like symbols and words as you would construct a paragraph. So I think that relationship between art and language and art and sign and symbol and the personal and political, all of that just feels so contemporary.
Right, I feel it in the work, all through the work. So Melissa, knowing her history so well, and she clearly, and just from what Adam mentioned too, she clearly made her own decisions. Like, I would imagine she was very definitive. If she were alive today, where do you think that she would carry this work, and what decisions she would make with where it would be placed and the context by which, just going on this too, because I think it's really, really important in the contemporary nature of this work to think about it, how it is existing today. And I love the idea, the fantasy of her being here and continuing this lineage with her work and the decisions she's making. I mean, what was interesting to me is that when she went to Princeton, when her husband had a I guess an apprentice, not apprentice, a teachership there, I want to say that, some kind of visiting professorship there. She worked with a Japanese artist, and so she continued, and that was later in life after they left Canada. So it's interesting to me, it seemed like she was open to continuing to study too. So what do you think that she would be doing?
Well, I think she gives some pretty clear direction about that. I mean, she was a humanist through and through, and actually I brought this paper because I want to quote from her as opposed to me saying it. So she's critiquing ABEX, and which all figurative artists do at the time, and I'm not sure later she felt as strongly about this, to be quite honest. But she says, she says art today should be oriented to the possibility of public meaning rather than private fancies, and should embody values rising from the modern relationship of people. And I think she was a humanist, and I think that would continue. And I think certainly, the context of McCarthy and early Cold War years, and conventional constraints on women particularly, and that those were her. Those were the points of the relationship of people that she chose to address, right? That those were the things that were impeding the relationship of people. And I think she would probably continue in that. Like, what would her artwork look like? I don't know. But I think that is sort of who she was, at least as an artist. And certainly, not to make a commentary about today, but certainly today there are constraints on women that have arisen out of the political situation now as well. I think she would be right in the middle of it. As a humanist, right? Turning into a visual, parables and fables of the social constraints of today, the social and political constraints.
I mean, I can see her teaching too, because her husband was so involved in that, and being an activist too. I can see her perhaps being involved in herself in an outspoken way, continuing what she talks about in her paintings. So it's interesting with her life, and like many other women, I would love to open this to everyone. This is going off script, but I was just talking to Ted about this earlier. Is that as we all know, women are discovered, quote unquote, after perhaps in their later years. I did a podcast with these two women called Two Old Bitches, sorry, that's what they call themselves, and very generously and affectionately. And they once told me that they were sharing with me on this podcast that, young girls get doted on when they're very young, and then after 60-ish, and this is from my research for my book too, women are more forgotten, and especially women of color, and women artists. And then in between, we're pushed and pulled in many different ways, I'll just say that. What do you think about, and this goes back to how things have changed, has that changed? I mean, what's wonderful about Hirschl Adler had all of you celebrating her work here, bringing her work to the forefront, but then again, it is sad that not a lot of women have this opportunity later in their years. Has that changed? Do you think that's getting better, where women are consistently being celebrated through their life and not just being discovered after a certain age? Jessica? You're just continuing. I need to hear that yes, that has changed.
I was going to say, I hate to be Debbie Downer in this, but I don't think it has changed. I mean, I worked with artists at different stages of their careers, and there's still this big gap, right? There's still this big, there are big differences in the way they're perceived, in the way that they're presenting their careers. I mean, a conversation comes to mind that I overheard at an art fair, like maybe 6 years ago. It was a collector talking to a dealer, and the collector was male, and so was the dealer. And he said something about, you have all these great works by women. I'm kind of, getting a ton of these because they're great prices. The prices are right, which sounds offensive, but he's also helping the market a little bit and making this person aware. It was just, I kind of froze in my steps, and luckily was not facing them because I think my face would have given a lot of way. But I just, that conversation stuck with me for 5+ years, and thinking about, someone saying that and someone, and I couldn't hear the dealer's response actually, because they were a bit quieter in there. But when you think about that and strategy, and people are thinking about those things, they are changing in terms of, they're noticing it, I guess, if that makes sense. People are noticing this big disparity. And some people are taking advantage of it, and maybe 10 years from now it will pay off for them. But maybe it won't, or maybe slow change is
It's also art's a commodity, and
It is.
and that's what
Absolutely.
it is. There's been a kind of fetishization, I think, of older women artists in the past few years with Betty Tompkins and Judy Chicago and Judith Bernstein, and the Times Magazine did a long piece about, older women artists. They exist, and they're great, and their markets have been reinvigorated. But I think, like any fetishization, it comes and goes. I mean, when I was in grad school, it was young artists, and it might be artists of color, it might be older women artists, and they're healthy aspects and they're unhealthy aspects. So
big shows like Hilma af Klint and discoveries like
Carmen
that are also
Herrera.
happening, right? Yeah.
I think the upside, though, and to go in the opposite direction of what we know today, is that Honoré's work makes me think too of the diversification of different, besides a gallery situation here, maybe as an anchor, but there's so many other ways in which artists can sustain a creative life outside of this gallery system too, and that a context in addition, like where this work can go in many, many different places. I could even see her work in, let's say, a Smithsonian museum and talking about work, for example, or the National Museum of Women in the Arts, for example, as a source of conversation and developing a different context. So I think that to turn this back around into you, Natalie, as a living artist today, how do we change that trajectory of that? I mean, and if thinking that Honoré is here today, I'm just imagining her right here with us. If she was here with us, what could she do to be able to take advantage of this and to make that grow, and other artists with her perhaps at this stage in her life, if she were still alive today? What would you say? How can we turn that around as artists, women artists?
turn
This
pigeonholing around.
and also the fact that we're being discovered, for example, and not having this consistency. And what can we do as artists, do you think? I mean, you're a great example because you wear multiple hats and you're out there in the world, highly successful and getting your work out there. What do you think other women could do to change that trajectory or contribute to that?
I think I can only speak from my experience,
Yeah.
but I've had amazing women mentors, and I think that makes a huge difference.
That's
Women
great.
who who've supported me, with art historians, artists. I think that's a type of activism that is just taken for granted in terms of men passing that down to other men. And I think that's something women can be really cognizant of, both receiving it but also giving it. I think there are really amazing women who are doing this in the art world, like Thelma Golden and Jeannie Greenberg, who I work with, who kind of sole mission is to support women and artists of color. I think, individuals in auction houses can spotlight women artists and put them in exhibitions, and galleries can work to raise their prices. And so I think it's a multifaceted approach that's necessary, and curators putting on exhibitions, irrespective of, is this woman selling for the same prices that a man sells for, which often dictates who gets the exhibitions, who's most visible at auction, who's represented by a gallery. There are some galleries in New York that don't even show a single woman. Michael Werner doesn't show one woman, and that's disgraceful. And and it's not for lack of talent.
I agree. So Melissa, I just have a few more questions and we'll open it up. Are you all warmed up yet? Okay.
Can't leave without asking a question.
No. Well, I'm gonna start to pick on some people in the audience, if we don't. So if you were to think about a lot of the work in this room, and this is obviously a stack, I mean, I can analyze this painting to death, like even with the dog looking at her, I mean, there's so much going on. Could you just get some insight actually into your discoveries that you found through her, study of her and her work? Because I'm sure it was absolutely fascinating to take that journey. If you were to point us into, not to put you on the spot, but there's some, like this painting here, which is incredibly also loaded, I think. I would love to just dive into like analyzing as we were there and to be able to think about her liberation through, let's say, that painting, if you don't mind, or if there's something else here you want to talk about.
No, and actually that's one of my favorites.
Oh, good. Perfect.
And partially because of the process that is both revealed again in early photography. So the horizon line on that was very low, actually, originally. And then she added it and put in some cows. But she also thought through that composition very, very carefully and the relationships. And that's actually, talking about discoveries, that's something that I realized in going through her papers are at the Archives of American Art. And when I went through them, I mean, for good and for bad, it was before they were indexed.
What was that like?
It's a little crazy.
Oh my gosh! What a labor of love.
Yeah, I had to keep going to Lisa Carwin and saying, "Can I take this paper clip off?"
Oh my
God! Okay, if I do this.
Amazing.
But what was interesting was I came away thinking, all artists keep, I shouldn't say all artists, many artists keep source files, and and so there's lots of source files. They all do. I'm going through them, and then I started to realize that they're actually, and they're put in, and this comes out in the catalog, that they're put in categories, thematic categories. But even more so than that, and I surely hope the archives did not change around the order of them, because it became very clear to me that she was putting them in order within those files of relationships. That then when I looked at the paintings, you realize there's this whole internal process of relationships between things. And also in her drawings, I started to realize, and also in the source materials, you're looking at images and then you realize that she's including the captions, like she's not cutting out the captions, and that they often have and often the caption she's cutting around is a caption that goes with an ad below it, but it's an interesting juxtaposition with the image that she keeps. And also the drawings, she would write little notes on the bottom of the drawings. So, like there's one innocuous, or visually innocuous drawing of them, very sketches, these little thumbnail sketches of a man and a woman, and they're sitting at a table. But at the bottom it says, and it's in the 70s, and it says they lost a son. And so suddenly it's like this whole loaded thing that doesn't, but that's pretty consistent in her work. So this painting, she keeps shifting around the relationship of those four people. And in putting the horizon line up, and she adds these chairs and these things that have sort of exploded, right? And so I start looking at her paintings for things that are falling apart, right? Or being blown out, because it's sort of the psychic energy that's in between these figures. So she isn't so much interested in the character of a person, but rather in the dynamics between the people. Yeah. And I think she's really, really brilliant at that. And to do it visually, right? To set up the stage, but not to be verbal, not to be explicit and verbal, and to lay it out for you. And so, the figures are facing different directions until she works it out in there's a couple of oil sketches and some drawings for it, and then eventually the woman's that black hat with I just read that as a Medusa with the snakes and and the thing is also, I would come across these paintings, and until we could sort of dig them out and find them and look at them in person, they're such a different thing in person. So I would be taking all these notes and I'd have all these ideas, and then I'd see them in person, and it's the part of it is the colorist in her that suddenly changes the relationships. You know, it's a particular green gives a completely different feeling than another green, right? So it's the sort of acidic level of the colors, I think, that also feed into how you look at these. But so like this painting went through many, many changes.
It did.
And a
Did you ever
process.
see her face?
No.
Never.
But she didn't have a hat like that necessarily. And for a while, the little girl, there's a little drawing where the little girl is not facing you, so kind of traditional. She's not a mirror of her mother, right? I think at one point she's looking at her mother, or she's looking somewhere else or something, and there's a point when the man's looking forward, and then so it's all about setting this up so that it's in the the painting itself, and then coming back and changing that horizon line so the green's behind them, right?
So interesting.
Yeah.
Now, just one last question for everyone, if we can all answer this, or all of you. If you were to, giving advice to young women artists, what can we take away from this exhibition and Honoré to be able to share with some advice from what we've learned here to give to some young artists? Natalie.
Oh.
You got no time to think about it.
I know, it's off script. I'm sure you could do it. You could say.
Well, this has been true in my life, so I would say to someone else, follow your instincts, follow your freakiness, follow your proclivities, and let them be what they are, and don't worry about categorizing them. Because one thing I love about her work is that I can't quite understand what these paintings are, where they belong,
I love that.
and that's a great feeling, not belonging somewhere. And I think over time that proves to be long-lasting and full of possibility.
Perfect.
Yeah, I had very similar thoughts, more about like following your passion, but also I've thought a lot about the categorization. You would use the word surrealism, and I've heard other words used and not letting yourself be categorized, which is kind of key, especially a young artist starting out, but also looking at art history, right? There are things to be learned there from all artists, and what people gravitate to. I always tell, I talk to a lot of artists, and I always tell them to just look at tons of art. It's not, it doesn't mean you're necessarily bringing that into your own practice, but it's just like anything else. You know everything that's out there and that's happening, and until you get like art fair fever or whatever it is, or whatever venue that you use to look at artwork, just like fill yourself up on it.
I guess I go back to her historical context, which is, when I first started working on her, she comes out of the social realist, and she says, I was looking for something to say, and I saw these WPA murals and Ben Shahn, and those were my people, but their time was sort of done. And so she's a younger generation than that, but she really grounds herself in it, and she stays grounded in it in a world that changes very much, right? But she doesn't, the rest of the world then doesn't catch up with her until the next generation. So she's sort of this middle generation, and she just sort of did what she did without trying to adjust, without trying to stick to the earlier generation that she comes out of and the later generation that follows. And I think that in one sense, that to me is what makes her so important.
Yeah.
Is that transitional moment that she's in.
Great. Wonderful. All right. Well, who would like to start with the questions before I call on people in the audience? Anybody have any thoughts?
So, in relationship to the Auckland show, her work, the 184 paintings that weren't for view until the 1980s, really, started, the series was 1908 to 1912. There's a preciousness that happens, and then she chose not to be recognized in her time because she didn't think it was going to be effective. But there's something for me that felt larger in the conversation for women. I'm an architect, but it's not the same, but there's similarities. And I feel like, it angers me that these women aren't fully recognized as full contributors to the profession of whatever art they're choosing to practice in until they're dead. And I feel like that's mean, I don't know how to articulate what I'm saying.
No,
There's a-
Oh, you did, it was very well said. I can't agree with you more, but I have to say that I go back and forth with galleries, and people would definitely know that from a lot of commentary that I've given. And I have to applaud Hirschl Adler for doing this, because I think that it's really, really important if more galleries, but also more universities and university galleries, at any venue really, could show people who aren't as recognized. You know, oftentimes museums show the same artist over and over again for financial reasons or otherwise. So it takes a bit of risk-taking, I think.
Well, no, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be looking at them. I'm talking about, it goes back to the question of the value, right? The 14 million to 150 million.
Oh, I see.
I wasn't talking about, yes, I mean, I remember I was at Yale in the 80s and I saw the first Ava Hesse show that was there.
Oh, I saw that. That was amazing.
89, it was 1989.
I saw that. That was incredible.
It was a great
Right.
show. And so
Oh, yeah,
yes,
that's amazing.
it was a great show. So but my question is more about value, right? So it's the 14 million to the 150 million of dead artists, men to women. That's like a math problem.
But I think that, and I would love to ask all of you what you think, but also that's actually a societal problem, right? So you mentioned the 81 cents versus to the dollar, right? I mean, that's a bigger issue. Any comments?
We're talking 10 cents to the dollar.
Yeah, oh, sorry, 10 cents.
Yeah, I mean,
81 cents. That's
it's
right,
very
exactly. You're correct.
Yeah, I mean, it's about knowledge, right? It's about bringing things to the forefront. I mean, it's slowly happening, but the problem is that it's slowly happening.
Right.
I mean, the great thing is that we're getting these statistics now. 20 years ago, no one was even bringing these stats up, right? So we weren't really like counting the numbers and looking at it. I mean, internationally, it's a problem. In the U.S., it's you know, somewhat of a bigger problem in some ways. If you look at the Venice Biennial that opens later this week, and some of you might be heading there. In 2009, it had like 43% women, and then there was a big dip where it was like 30 or 29, and you know, it's back up to a little bit, I think less than 50%. But you know, it's about like getting there and maintaining it and moving forward. I mean, I'm the director of ArtTable, and it's an organization for women in the arts. That's all we do. But, and it's about, you know, supporting women across their careers and at all stages of their career. But the reason I bring it up is because only until about 6 years ago did ArtTable even make a complete effort to say we're only going to have artist talks with women artists, because they haven't been brought to the forefront. But until then, we weren't focusing, we weren't saying, you know, just women artists, right? But we weren't, you know, we didn't set out to exclude men. We just wanted to bring more women artists to the forefront and bring more knowledge to our members and to the public. So, I mean, it's a 39-year-old organization that has only been focusing on that the last 6 years, right? So it's part of the problem in getting lots of people to focus on those specific things and bringing more knowledge to the public. And galleries are doing it slowly.
Yeah, but it's also not, I think, just about prices, because I have a friend who, her work goes up at auction for a couple $1 million. She can't even sell to a private collector anymore. And that's a huge problem. And so because they'll just flip the private collectors. Even if they promise a work to a museum and they sign something, they still flip it. What are you gonna do, sue them? And she's not seeing any of that money.
Right, yeah.
Because her primary prices can't keep up with the secondary market, and now she can only sell to institutions who can't afford them. And so that's a problem, but I think it's the infrastructure around that needs to, like Linda Nochlin wrote about why there are no great women artists. It's the infrastructure. It's you know, we have access to education, but do we have parity in terms of representation in museums and exhibitions and catalogs and books, and all of that is really important as well.
I agree. Do you have thoughts on that?
Just didn't for a minute there.
There you go.
Actually do. He said something about strategies, and it made me think that you know, one of the things that I think often, or maybe needs to be looked at more clearly or closely, and I'm just thinking of a number of women artists who I'm, well, Doris Lee, who I'm working on now, and Sharon, who I worked on, and is the strategies, and Hilda Klimt is what made me think of this, are the strategies that women use or that women employ to remain creative, right? I mean, so Sharrer, you know, with being blacklisted essentially in the Cold War, or wanting to continue a critique that that in the years when she wants to do that would bring enormous, you know, vulnerability to her, right, politically, and that's a real thing. And so I became very interested in how she negotiated that visually and the strategies she used for that. Or Doris Lee, an artist I'm working on now, how do you negotiate a strategy of the change in the art world from American scene painting to modernism, and to turning more towards commercial art and illustration and design. She was a brilliant designer, Doris Lee, and so these different venues in which women artists do to negotiate the world that isn't at parity. And I think we don't often look at those negotiations and those artists who do those the various kinds of negotiations they do, really, or strategies maybe, really well. And I think that's a, you know, looking at women artists who do that is to me a way to find women artists in history, because I'm not a contemporary curator, who have something more going on than what might seem in the surface, because they don't fit a narrative necessarily, or they seem to have dropped out of the narrative, but to look at what strategy did they use, to deal with that, and some of them are really smart and really visual. They just take them off that main path, but it's women to dig. That's a way to find those women.
And that means transparency, more transparency in our world too.
That's I think the biggest realization I've had about my own work and career is that, you know, I can take drawing and now publishing books on fairy tales. I collaborate with a fairy tale scholar, and I write for the books, and I write as well, besides essays, personal essays about sexual harassment in the art world, or different or doing a ballet. It's a way to get my vision out insidiously and with tentacles, because perhaps it's not a straight path for someone like me, especially being a figurative painter. And that's another level of, oh, you're a woman, you're a figurative painter, you're, you know, telling stories, it's academic, it's like, you know, so it's another way to get it out.
I don't think there's any straight paths at all, you know, anymore anyway as an artist. Like, I think that those multiple hats you wear is actually so many artists are doing so many different things now that reach different parts of their creativity. I think that's great that you're doing that.
Well, I think women, to your point, women have had to figure that out, whereas men can just be Mark Groatian and show Gagosian. Or Josh Smith, and women can't.
But isn't that part of why women don't make the same leap? They don't get, I mean, you know,
they're trying to
no,
make it.
No, what I mean is, when we step off the path and we have to go on a different path in order to continue creative work, it also puts us behind in line to the guys who are moving ahead. And I've just seen within architecture, you know, women fall off the path.
I know.
And then they have to come back, and they come back less. I'm not like they're coming back as lesser, and they're not. And the guys are just sort of moving forward.
I want to open up to other questions, but I just want to say that to that. I just think that the path may be more creative and different, but it may just be different. So I don't think that we're behind. And I actually think that having a straight path is a myth. It's absolutely a myth. Well, actually, I know it's a myth. So from doing these books that I've done. Okay, other questions from the audience? Yes, Lauren.
A comment, I think, being in the gallery world. I mean, the reality is it's expensive to run a gallery.
Correct.
These fares are exorbitant.
Absolutely.
You know, sort of the cost of doing business or for Stuart, you can tell us more about this, but basically, you know, this Hirschl Adler is amazing because you are allowed to take work, us as, you know, salespeople and
wonderful.
supporting artists, we're given the freedom to take some risk here. But a lot of galleries, they can't, they gotta pay the bills, and they have, and you get this handful of collectors and they're trophy hunting.
Mm-hmm.
And so the gallerists at the art fairs need to pay their bills, so they need to have, at least half the booth be a sure thing.
Yeah.
And so it's just sort of sad, it's a sad comment in that it comes down to finances often, and museums, they need to up their memberships,
Right.
and they need to up their viewerships, and so we all talk about, let's have a great show that speaks to everybody and is all inclusive. Well, that might not sell tickets to the museum and get donors, and it's just complicated. So we can all talk about how you can support the artists, and ultimately they need to catch a break, and they need to catch the eye of a curator or a gallerist who's going to believe in them and kind of take a chance, or that has the backing to do it.
But these days, there's kind of no excuse, because we have amazing women like Rona Hoffman and Barbara Gladstone and Mary Goodman and Mary Boone, whatever. But we have women who have shown how we can do it, and so Victoria Moreau, Alice Neal. That's not even. It's not even. I hear that of the sure thing and the this and the that, but that's up to the infrastructure, galleries included, to support that and change that, and
raise your prices,
Yeah.
develop the market,
Yeah.
and it's a lot of pressure to do these fairs, keep putting the work out there, and if you raise the prices too quickly, then you lose certain collectors who won't be able to afford it. This is complicated.
What do you think? I have a comment on that too, but what do you think? What do you think in response?
Well, I ran a gallery for 11 years,
That's
so
what I'm
I
asking.
totally get it.
Yeah.
It's super hard, right?
Yeah.
You don't always, you have to pay your bills, right? And you have to do all of the things and keep the infrastructure. You won't be good to anyone, any of the artists that you represent. But I think when galleries stick with their program and what they want to show and who they want to show, and are, picking artists on, any type of, race or gender or anything like that, and just sticking with their program, then they're doing everyone a service. But I think in the past, there's been a lot of institutions that just gravitated towards men for pure dollar reasons. So it's about balance, to me, and keeping that going and looking at the bottom line and making wise choices. It's not easy. Everything has gotten more and more expensive, and I think harder for galleries, especially in the last 10 years or so.
The gallery needs to stay in business.
That's right.
Just,
Absolutely.
shepherd the artist to the next.
That's right.
Well, okay, so I'm thinking the museum world. And I guess I've never said this in this context, but I say it all the time. My assistant curator's here, she's gonna roll her eyes and say, yes, you say that all the time. But I think we have to learn to trust two things as museum institutions, or certainly as curators. And one is that we have to learn to trust the artwork. And that is in presenting exhibitions to our directors and our boards and acquisitions, and that we trust the work, that we trust this woman's work, right? And when it's on the wall, that we trust that it's able to say something, right? That it doesn't have to have that male name or the sure thing, or that work right there, regardless if we did it, is able to say something. And we also have to trust our audience, that we don't have to explain everything to them and talk down to them and write it. Then I'm speaking from the museum world here, right? So it's a little different, but that someone coming off the street because they just want air conditioning, St. Louis, oh my God, St. Louis, on one hand, the museum is free, which is fabulous, it is free, and then the kinds of audience that come in I love it, because I look over at the zoo out of my office, which is great. So you're out at the zoo and it's 80 degrees in St. Louis in July and it's miserable, and you come in the art museum because it's free and it has air conditioning, and I'm all for that. Come on in, right? But as curators, we you have to trust that audience that they'll figure it out.
Right.
You know, that you don't have to be like, oh, you gotta explain this to them and do that. No, you don't. You have to trust the art that it can say something, and you trust the audience that it's able to have a dialogue with that art. And so, you know, in talking about, you know, sure thing or men, or, and, you know, we face this with exhibitions, you know, how many people will come through, and is it known, and how are we gonna market that, and in fact, when this show was at Columbus, you know, museums do this just like galleries. You have a big blockbuster, and then you balance it with a more scholarly show that maybe won't have so many, but it has a national audience, and so that's how you gauge success. And I mean, healthy museums, you know, balance those things. And Sharrer, this show at Columbus was, okay, Melissa's done another academic show, and it's great. We're just, you know, bringing another woman artist out, and it probably won't have that big of an audience, but we'll focus on the catalog and put our money into that. And it had a fabulous audience. By word of mouth, it was one of their highest audition shows. But you have to trust that the artwork can say something. And of course, it was right at the moment when sort of women's issues were at the forefront. So actually, Columbus was very smart. It was originally, what was my title? I'm terrible at it. Subversion and Surrealism in the art. And I guess in some conversation, which I don't even remember having, I said to our director, it's a dangerous woman. So that became the title. So, but that was really smart and nimble to do at the time to connect to a moment, right? But I just think we have to trust that women artists can carry that, as you said, that trust that they can carry, and that's I mean, trust is a scary thing.
I think that also it just speaks to the greater problem of raising the value of the arts today. That's really the issue. It's like how do you cultivate new collectors? How do you get it out of exclusivity into inclusivity? And the art world oftentimes has isolated itself. So the longer it's been isolating itself, therefore we limit our possibilities. That's what I think. Last question. Oh, we have 2 questions. Yes.
Did she paint these pictures with the intention of them being commercially successful? I mean, did she make changes because she thought it would appeal more to people?
Can you answer that briefly?
Yes, I can do it very briefly. I think she made changes because it made better sense to her, not because it would make it more commercially. But she was she didn't really want to be a part of the gallery scene. There are very clear letters that she was quite specific that she wanted gallery representation and which gallery and what paintings she thought belonged in museums. And so she was there. She didn't want to be in the middle of the gallery scene, but she definitely, yeah.
From a dealer standpoint, I would say that if we were going to categorize the inquiries that we are getting now and have for the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, overwhelmingly, the inquiries that we get are works by women artists and by African American artists.
Oh, good.
To a point where the curator of American art at one of the major museums in this country said to me, don't offer us anything that doesn't fall into one of those 2 categories. That's our new mission statement. And do I think that's right? Don't ask me. Now, one interesting thing is, I think that the price structure of works by African American artists, like Tanner, like Duncanson, like Joshua Johnson, has risen more dramatically than have works by women artists. But I think there are fewer African American artists historically that are at that level. And every museum wants to have those artists represented. And so an artist like Tanner, whom I personally don't think is a very good artist, but nevertheless has become very, very expensive. Now, having said one thing, I have also a question. Could you, since this picture behind you is the most visible to all of us, what is the iconography of the flypaper, the dancing plate, the spoons, the bent fork?
Oh, the dish runner with the spoon.
Wow.
They did a little, the cow, the little, yeah, the little dog likes to see such sport, and the dog ran over with the spoon, or however that goes. You know that. So it's nursery rhyme. So she's drawing from nursery rhyme, but you know, it's also one of deviance, right? The cow ran over, the little dog or the cow jumped over there. Everybody's doing things they're not supposed to do, and they're kind of sneaky, right? Running away with the spoon. So they're sort of,
There's a big penis in the back.
yeah. And she does use the fly paper often. I mean, that's a motif that shows up. So, I like these because every time I stand in front, and I've looked at them a lot, I go somewhere else, I go some other direction, or, flies are, she's very interested in the sort of underbelly and the, there's flies stuck and dead flies, and there's a penis behind the curtain. I mean, I don't know, where to go with that, but she's definitely, I like the, you said she's grounded with that hand on her, and the
arm.
look down, and she's in charge of this deviant world, right? This deviant world that's made it into the nursery rhyme.
Yes.
Okay, last question.
Okay, I don't know if it's a question, but at the beginning you asked about whether she was liberated, and then I kind of mixed it with when you were talking about trusting the audience. When I had never seen her painting, thanks to Sally for inviting me today. As I walk around and I see the nude pieces of it, the women taking center pieces, immediately it's like, I don't know if she was liberated, but she's liberating me.
Good.
By completely desubjectifying the female body, by completely desubjectifying the sexuality of the female, and really putting us out there, up front, with all exposed, with no shame, with nothing to really hide or, re-identify or reprogram within. And in that sense, I think it's important to trust that the audience somehow will connect with what we are seeing, that somehow we will make it through, wow, this has to be a little bit with the #MeToo movement and saying, I am this and I'm not an object, I'm just a human being. So it's really beautiful to have that perspective and trust the audience and to feel the liberation from the artist, of whatever her intention was. I mean, I couldn't necessarily even start again. But just to have that piece there, that the power of the artist is being transmitted to those pieces, and that the audience, whether we are versed on the artist or not, or the intent, we will get something out of it.
Thank you.
Whatever that is.
I think that's a
She'd
great.
never seen a game by
That's wonderful.
Honoré. It's just like, come to this event
Thank
tonight,
you.
but that's really.
It's a wonderful way to end because we started with liberation and ended. So thank you.